Hello and welcome to the third video lecture of Sacraments and Worship. This lecture is on Edward Schillebeeckx's book, Christ, the Sacrament of the Encounter with God. We will be reading this book for our class on Friday. So for class on Friday, I would like you to bring your daily writing assignment, which is a brief, maybe a paragraph on how you would summarize the book or what you think is most important about it, or maybe something you found particularly challenging about it. Doesn't matter what, just something to prepare you to come in to talk on Friday. And a question that you have about the reading from this week. So the question could be on any of the readings that you've done up to this point in the class. Schillebeeckx's book was first published in 1960 in Dutch, and then subsequently, 1963 in Dutch, and then at the same time in English. Oh no, I was right the first time. 1960 in Dutch, 1963 in English, and this book was really very groundbreaking for sacramental theology, as you read about in that very first essay. One of the things that both Edward Schillebeeckx and Karl Rahner in different ways did for sacramental theology is they broadened the understanding of what a sacrament was so that we could understand the sacramentality, or the way that other things, other liturgies, and even other things in creation function like the sacraments. So I hope you'll see that in this book. Sorry for my voice. I have a little bit of a head cold as I'm recording this, so hopefully you'll still be able to understand me pretty well. So here we are, your introduction to Edward Schillebeeckx's theology of encounter in the sacraments, grace and worship. First of all, one of the things that's helpful as you're reading Schillebeeckx's text is that Schillebeeckx envisions a kind of gap between human beings and God. That gap is not only due to sin. It has to do with the fact that human beings are finite creatures and God is infinite. In addition to that, of course, there's the gap of sin that really exacerbates the separation between human beings and God. But all religions, from Schillebeeckx's perspective, are an attempt by both God and humanity to overcome that gap, that separation that's really very unnatural for human beings and for God, and to try to restore the unity that's our rightful condition. So, for Schillebeeckx, even the natural religions or the pagan religions are a manifestation in the world of God's desire to save human beings and the human response to that desire on the part of God. They're, of course, for him mistaken, but they are a real attempt to overcome, and a partially successful attempt even, to overcome that gap between human beings and God. Judaism, he'd even go further and say that the Jewish covenant was the beginning of the church and actually is, in fact, a real revelation on the part of God. We'll get to that in a minute. A real communication of grace on the part of God and a real response of human beings on the part of the Jews. So, very interesting. If we recall, of course, that this book was written before Vatican II, so whatever some of these things that are not surprising to those of us who are reading it at this point in history would have nonetheless been very groundbreaking when the book was written. So Judaism is a real but incomplete, if you will, bridge across this gap. Jesus Christ becomes the first complete bridge across the gap. It completes, in a sense, even the Jewish covenant that came before is completed in Jesus for Schillebeeckx. And then Christianity is of course, the current bridge, if you will, but the bridge that's built on the foundation of Jesus Christ's relationship with God, which we inherit, if you will, in the sacraments. So first I want to call attention to this notion of encounter. This term, encounter, already tells us that we're not looking anymore at a model of the sacraments that says here are the objective necessary things that you must have to have a sacrament, and if you have those things, then the sacramental grace automatically or automagically or miraculously appears and is there, and there's nothing else to worry about. Instead, Encounter, already drawing from a philosophical viewpoint from personalism, it already treats the language of grace as a language of relationship and desire. So this means that the instead of talking about the language of causality and production, or machinery, if you will, we're going to be talking about the language of love relationships, or parent-child relationships, or family relationships. These are the terms that we think are most appropriate to sacraments. So that puts us in a very different place. And this really, I have it characterized here as a paradigm shift, and it really is. The sacraments are a communication or a mediation. If you recall, even in Thomas Aquinas, despite the fact that I think that his theology is very nuanced, he uses the term of instrument rather than the term of communication, even though he does say that it's God's intention and that's why they work. But he uses the term of instrument, and later on in history, that term would be thought of as almost like a crank. So we think of if you will, the sacramental machine, and the sacrament is a crank that we stick in the side and turn the crank, and as long as you turn the crank, then grace kind of pops out at the bottom and you get your grace pellet and everything is good. Schillebeeckx and Rahner very definitively turn Catholic sacramental theology away, probably forever, from this understanding of how grace works. So if we think of grace instead as a communication or mediation, we can see why some of the burden of that mediation, some of the requirements that are associated with that mediation would be on the receiver and not only on the giver. So I want to start by actually going through and calling your attention before you start the reading to the different definitions of sacrament that you'll find in the first half of Schillebeeckx's book. Now, when I say the first half, and I hope you may have your book in front of you. If you don't, you might want to pause it and get that. But when I say the first half, what's really groundbreaking about this work is the first 80 pages, believe it or not. Those are the most groundbreaking. At the end of the first 80 pages, what we really start to see, starting at page 82, where he does the concept of ex opere operato, is we start to see the case made by Schillebeeckx that his way of thinking about the sacraments will support all the traditional understanding of how the sacraments work that we had in Tridentine Catholicism. This is a fascinating piece of work that he does, and it's actually very helpful because it's really the only place that many of us will encounter this terminology like baptism by desire, revival, office, and charism. And so we will talk about that a little bit. But the first 80 pages or 81 pages are the really new things that he's doing, the new model that he's doing. So when I say in the first half, I'm talking about those first 80 pages of the book. How does he define the sacraments? If you remember, Thomas defined them as a sign of a sacred reality inasmuch as it is sanctifying human beings. Here are the sacramental definitions that are given by Schillebeeckx in his first two chapters. The sacraments are the properly human mode of encounter with God. Notice the turn to relational language here. This divine power to save, he's talking about the sacraments, appears to us in a visible form, so a visible sign of an invisible reality, but this is, the way he puts it here is a little bit more turned to the revelation, in other words, that we have to be able to see it for it to actually function. And then here's one of the longest ones, page 52 to 53. A sacrament, that is, an act of the primordial sacrament that which is the church, something I'll talk about in a minute, is a visible action proceeding from the church as redemptive institution, An official ecclesial act performed in virtue either of the character of the priesthood or of the characters of baptism and confirmation. Hence, in this sense, a sacrament is actually something more than that which we usually understand under the term seven sacraments, but it is also something more limited than that which we have just called general visibility, meaning sacramentality as an outward manifestation not of office, but directly of inward communion in grace. All right, let me unpack this a little bit because this is one of the complicated definitions that he gives here. So, first of all, we have the notion from the page before that the sacraments are a visible and human manifestation of God's intention to save human beings. Some of those manifestations are just spring from the character of the church as an institution that's inspired by the Holy Spirit. These ones would have to do with sacramentality, but not necessarily from sacraments as we would want to define them. So down here at the bottom, at the end of this definition, meaning sacramentality as an outward manifestation of inward communion and grace, this might mean, for example, a Christian who opens her home or his home to the poor as a service to the homeless in the community and thinks of that as an act of grace. This would be a manifestation of the church's sacramentality, in that it would be the church making visible in the world the kingdom of God. But it would not be a sacrament properly because it's not a rite of the church, official ecclesial act, as it says up here. I don't mean, and Schillebeeckx doesn't mean to say that those actions are less valuable. It's just not the kind that we're talking about here. So in fact, actually, those actions are probably the end result of the church's visible reality, visible making present of God's kingdom in the world. But what we're looking at here is how that is made present in the sacraments. So, however, he says here, a sacrament is actually something more than what we usually understand under the term seven sacraments, and you could actually make a case based on the definition he gives here. For example, I think it'd be very easy to make a case that monastic vows fits the definition of sacrament that Schillebeeckx gives, because it's an official ecclesial act performed in virtue of the character of baptism and confirmation of those who participate in it. It is a visible action that proceeds from the church as redemptive institution. So in other words, I think actually that he doesn't make the case for monastic vows in this book, but it'd be very easy based on his definitions in this book to expand our technical definition of sacraments to include some rites that are not officially and normally thought of as sacraments. It'd be interesting to make a case, and maybe this would be something somebody would want to do for a final written project, to make a case for or against the idea that a funeral could be considered a sacrament based on this definition. Normally, of course, a funeral is not considered a sacrament because, as we say, the sacraments are for living people in order to allow them to progress in their life with God, and not for dead people. But I think based on some of the definitions in here, you could make a case that a funeral was sacramental, or at least was sacramental in certain ways, or you could definitely make a case that it was not sacramental as well. So it'd be interesting to see that as a final project if you're interested in it. Let's move on, because I do have at least one more definition. I actually think we have two. A sacrament is primarily and fundamentally a personal act of Christ himself, which reaches and involves us in the form of an institutional act performed by a person in the church, who in virtue of a sacramental character is empowered to do so by Christ himself, an act ex officio. So a sacrament is primarily and fundamentally a personal act of Christ himself. Already this is a completely reshaped understanding of the sacraments that really depends on seeing them as communication, as relational, rather than as functional. It reaches and involves us in the form of an institutional act, in other words, as a rite. Um, I say this even though I think the reason he uses the term institutional act is because sometimes it's hard to see the rite of penance as a rite, even now, much more so when he wrote, and we were still using the older form of the rite of penance. Performed by a person in the church who, in virtue of a sacramental character, note that it does not necessarily need to be the character of the priesthood, which is appropriate because, for example, in marriage, the sacrament is bestowed by the baptized man and woman rather than by a priest. So when he says an act ex officio, that's what he means, an act in virtue of office. All right, and finally on page 66, he gives his final definition of the sacraments. In this way, we arrive at a more determinate definition of the sacraments. They are ecclesial acts of worship in which the church, in communion of grace with its heavenly head, that is, together with Christ, pleads with the Father for the bestowal of grace on the recipient of the sacrament, and in which at the same time the church itself, as saving community in holy union with Christ, performs a saving act. Now, this is the first time in this lecture, but not at all the first time in the book, that you are introduced to Schillebeeckx's characteristic understanding of a sacrament. A sacrament for Schillebeeckx has two parts. It has the bestowal of grace on the recipient, which is the downward, remember we talked about this before, the downward movement that goes from God to human beings. And it also has the responding act of worship that the church here performed by the church, that is the responding thanksgiving and praise that's given to God. So we'll see that, but that for Schillebeeckx is really comes to be the definition of what a sacrament looks like. And so really anything that has these two characteristics where God is bestowing grace and human beings are responding with love and praise and thanksgiving can be analyzed and understood using the sacramental terminology that he offers. So let's take a look at how he does this. So when Schillebeeckx analyzes sacramental mediation, remember he starts with the gap between God. Up here at the top I have a triangle to remind you of the Trinity. And down here we have humanity. You should think of this at first as a blank. So all of these things are sort of set in to gradually build up a necessary bridge between God and humanity, because God and humanity, God loves human beings and human beings need God. So the first one is the human person of Jesus. Jesus is called by Schillebeeckx the primordial sacrament, and this has become very, very common in contemporary church language, that Christ is the primordial sacrament. And what he means by that is, if you go back to that definition that we talked about earlier, that Jesus Christ makes visible the relationship between God and humanity. So in his humanity, especially, Jesus Christ is receiving grace from God, the Trinity, and is responding with love and worship. In order to make this Christology work for us, we might need to pay a little more attention to Jesus' human nature than we're used to doing in our everyday thought processes. A lot of us in the church today tend to think of Jesus as God, and only kind of secondarily when we need to as a human person. But if you don't think of Jesus as a human person, this theology makes very little sense. So again, Jesus is receiving grace from God, the Trinity. Obviously, he receives it most closely from the Word, but also the Father and the Holy Spirit's relationships with the Word. So he receives grace from God in order to complete his human mission, and his human mission is carried out in love and faithfulness to God as well. So Jesus is, if you will, the perfect embodiment of the covenant, the perfect covenant between God and humanity, because as a human being, Jesus is subject to all the same temptations as all other human beings, but is able to respond with perfect love in every case. So if you, on page 39, for example, of Schillebeeckx's work, we see this Jesus' human love is the translation of divine love itself into human form. And for Schillebeeckx, that makes him the primordial sacrament. It's also, however, what makes him the perfect revelation of what God's divine love really is. And the unity between those two ideas, the idea of the sacrament as a revelation of God and the idea of the incarnation as a revelation of God, is something that we're going to see again in Ronner. So, then if you look down, you'll see, but Jesus, of course, dies, is resurrected, ascends into heaven, and when Jesus ascends into heaven, he leaves the human community without a visible manifestation of that mediation between God and human beings. That mediation still continues with Jesus' human nature in heaven, but Jesus' human nature in heaven is not visible to those of us who are still on earth. So for Schillebeeckx, that means that we need another visible manifestation that stands in the gap between God and humanity in order to transmit to us visibly and tangibly the love and allow us to return the worship that is our responsibility. So, for example, on page 63, Schillebeeckx treats this. Sometimes he calls this in the original of this, the sacrament. In later church terminology, what's usually said is that the church is the foundational or fundamental sacrament. In other words, it's the foundation that of the structure of communication between God and humanity, and all the other sacraments are built on that foundation and use that same structure. So, on page 63, to say that the Church in her sacraments is a prolongation of the earthly life of Christ appears therefore to be an elliptical or insufficient statement of the case. So that's true, but it's not good enough. Certainly, the Church in her visibility prolongs the function of the earthly visibility which Christ once enjoyed. But the Passover brought about a change of emphasis. The Christ lives now at this moment. His glorious body continues to fulfill the function it had during his earthly life. But because this sign of Jesus' life-giving redemptive act has become invisible to us, the body of the Lord is prolonged in a form which is visible on earth, in the sacramental church. In this sense, the church is a prolongation primarily of the heavenly Christ, and therefore it prolongs the function of the earthly body of Jesus. In other words, the church is united to the heavenly humanity of Christ, which is still performing this function of mediation between God and humanity, but now the visible means of that mediation on earth is the church. And as he says, the church in its sacraments. So, if you look at the diagram, you'll see the downward arrow. Jesus in his humanity transmits grace to the church. The church in her humanity transmits worship back to Jesus and ultimately to God in the sacraments. So then the 7 sacraments are these 7 lines here. No, I didn't assign specific sacraments to specific lines. But the 7 sacraments are specific instances for Schillebeeckx of the general function of the church, which means it's not necessary, as I said before, that there couldn't be, who knows, 2 or 3 more sacraments if we, decided to get more than 7. We could have 9, or perhaps it's enough to say that there's a variety of means of visibility in between by which the church transmits grace to humanity and allows humanity to worship God appropriately. I think that's all I had to say about this particular diagram. I'm sorry I'm not exactly the best diagram maker in all of life, so I hope this is acceptable, but it is somewhat helpful to picture it, I think. All right. So I have on this slide new sacraments because one of the results of this book is that whereas we saw after the Council of Trent, there is an anathema set against anyone who says that there are more or less than seven sacraments in the church. But Schillebeeckx actually identifies two sacraments: Christ, the primordial sacrament, and the church, the fundamental sacrament. I have page 15 and page 53, 52. Don't remember. Let me see what 52 is. Yeah, so on 52, he is just one of the places where he identifies the church as primordial sacrament. Sometimes he uses primordial sacrament for both. Later commentators become a little more specific about each. Now, this although this might seem to go against the councils of Trent, the theology, especially of the church as sacrament, and the foundational sacrament on which the other sacraments were built was made authoritative in the documents of Vatican II. So in actually several different documents, this notion arises, and it's implicit in Sacrosanctum Concilium. So this is now, if you will, at least the church fundamental sacrament is official church teaching. Then when he gets to the notion of the seven sacraments, he says in the concrete, a sacrament is simply the outwardly perceivable glance of God's generosity towards a particular man. In other words, it takes this mediation that's cosmic and always going on all the time, but it directs it towards a individual human person who needs God's love and generosity at that particular moment. So that really, and I also have this. So again, why the need for the specific seven sacraments after the Ascension? If Christ does not show himself to us in his own flesh, then he can make himself visibly present to and for us earthbound men only by taking up earthly non-glorified realities into his glorified saving activity. So here again we have a more flexible understanding of the sacraments. So this understanding allows us to say, okay, the seven sacraments that we have listed are the ones that were identified by the church over time as the non-glorified realities that Christ was using or is using to sanctify human beings. But they're certainly not the only ones that could be so used. So this is a helpful way of understanding the history of liturgy. So we can say, for example, all right, well, at some points in Christian history, the rite of foot washing was understood as was treated as a sacrament, and that really shouldn't bother us, even though we don't treat it as a sacrament today. It also helps us to make some sense of the Eastern churches, most of whom do not limit themselves to seven sacraments. So, for example, the Eastern Orthodox churches talk about the sacraments, but if you get a list, you might get 20 or 30 things. That was characteristic of Western sacramental theology too, even all the way to the 12th century. So it's not entirely surprising. So that's one of the advantages of this treatment of Schillebeeckx, is it gets us in touch with that older tradition that says that not only the seven sacraments, but really any particular visible way of manifesting grace and allowing us to worship God can be a sacrament. All right, so how does this finish? And this is very important to Schillebeeckx. There are three functions of the sacraments, and they correspond to the parts of history: the past, present, and future. And this is a truism since the Middle Ages. We have looked, at least the Middle Ages, we have looked at the relationship of sacrament to the past history of salvation, the present need of the person receiving the sacrament, and the future direction of that person and the whole church. So the first, the past, it is an anamnesis, which means commemoration, a commemoration of the past sacrifice of the cross. Two, it is a visible affirmation and bestowal of the actual gift of grace. And three, it is a pledge of the eschatological salvation and a herald of the parousia, because the sacraments are the sacramental presence of Christ the eschaton. One of the things that's helpful about Schillebeeckx's theology is it allows us to treat these three things in a way that thinks of them as a modes of relationship. So commemorating the past goodness of God to us correlates to our ability to receive the present gift of grace and directs us towards a future of trust and love for that same God who has been saving us. This is much superior to the older model of the sacraments, where the idea was that you get grace, and that somehow makes you more ready for the final judgment, but without this sense of conversion, encounter, and love relationship that's embedded in this particular way of seeing the relationship between these three parts. In the second half of the book, Schillebeeckx treats a whole bunch of traditional elements of Catholic sacramental theology from the Tridentine period and before. And I have a lot of them listed here, probably not all of them, but I have a number of them listed here because if you do not know what these things mean and you want to know, you can send me this as a question and I will attempt to answer it on Friday, or if I get enough, I will just go down this list on Friday and I will talk about all of them. So, ex opere operato, I think actually the treatment that Schillebeeckx gives beginning on page 82 and on to page 89 is probably the best treatment of ex opere operato causality I have ever seen anywhere. So I highly recommend that if you want to understand it. It's authentically Thomistic. It really follows what Thomas was doing. At the same time, it's very modern and very relevant and very comprehensible. It's a really, really good explanation. Schillebeeckx also treats the minister's intention in the performance of the sacraments, the office of the minister and the charism of the minister, the character bestowed by the sacraments, and what he calls the ecclesial effect. Sacraments of desire, which again is if you don't have the opportunity to receive a sacrament actually, but you really wish for God's grace, God will bestow that grace without the sacramental rite. The revival of the sacraments, which is in the case as if it's the revival of the sacraments, deals with cases in which the people who are receiving the sacraments aren't willing to actually receive the grace associated with the sacraments. And fruitfulness and grace, and I'll get to that later. But so anyway, we'll all these things are here in the book if you want to talk about them. If you're not interested, I may not deal with them on Friday at all. Against minimalism. So finally, I want to call your attention. This is actually in the second half of the book to one of his, I think, greatest. This is a consequence of the theology he's given in the first half of the book, but it really shows you the strength and power of the theology. So remember, in the early 20th century, before this book was written, the normal situation that was required for sacramental practice was that the minister be validly ordained, or let's say a valid minister for the sacrament, which might or might not require them to be ordained, and that he intend to do what the church is doing. This is the way it is normally treated. But Schillebeeckx really, he debates that point. He says, no, actually, that's not the normal. The minimal situation is when the minister merely intends to do what the church does. But the normal situation, the one against which we should judge every performance of the sacraments, is actually a minister who's very much invested in this particular rite as his personal and private prayer, as well as a rite that he does by office ex officio. So what he says here is the normal situation required strictly by the fullness of the church's being is that of a sacramental administration in which the minister performs the acts of his office in such a way that they are at the same time an expression of his own personal dedication to the apostolate and of his will really to sanctify the persons to whom he administers the sacraments. In other words, the real norm against which sacramental practice should be measured is the norm of fervent and sincere prayer on the part of the minister, and then the ex officio blends seamlessly then with his real devotion and his real love and faithfulness to his own ministry and to the people to whom he's ministering. So this is a real statement against minimalism, and you can actually see how far this understanding of sacramental life is expressed in church documents such as, for example, Sacrosanctum Concilium, where the emphasis turns from the minimum that we absolutely need to make sure is there to really we should be looking for the functional minimum, the normal situation, which is that we need to encourage as often as possible and really all the time, this is what he means by required strictly, that the minister is sincerely, personally invested in the prayers of the church that are required for the sacraments to be performed. And that is the end of our discussion of Schillebeeckx. When we meet on Friday, I will talk more about Rahner. There's also going to be a video on Rahner up on Moodle for you to get prepared. And I look forward to seeing you Friday.